All right, well, good day, everybody, wherever you are. I'm pleased to be able to present a small educational session on generic TKIs and how you as a physician can use them to the safest and best advantage for your patient. And I would like to thank the International CML Foundation for this invitation. These are my disclosures, and basically, in terms of the brand name products that are out there, I've worked with most of the companies in terms of studies, research, and advisory boards. So let's look into some of the background on generics. Why don't we just start with a plain and simple definition from the US Food and Drug Association? It's a medication that's exactly the same as an already marketed brand name drug in terms of the active product. And it supposedly is the same strength, route of administration, quality, and has the same bioequivalence. What may be different is some of the excipient or the filler that's in the drug. And it should work the same way as a brand name medication, and it should be able to substitute for a brand name medication. But as we all know, this is not always the case. So there have been generics available for some TKIs for years. In fact, some countries such as India and Brazil, Argentina, had generics almost as soon as Gleevec came out the first time. But they've slowly been evolving around the world, and most countries now have generic imatinib available. And in many countries, including my own, there are generics now available for dasatinib and rarely for some of the other second generation drugs. What can be introduced into any one country may depend on a number of different reasons. Whether there's some kind of obstruction to ongoing funding of brand name medications, for instance, if the provider will only fund brand name, when patents on the brand name expire, or even if they exist, there's a typo, I'm sorry about that, or even exist. Some countries really have no brand name patents, and some they're very short. Canada, for instance, is several years short of the United States, which causes some problems just crossing the border. Are there patent laws to begin with? And this has been an issue in many countries, and things have firmed up in many ways. In some places, a generic manufacturer could just drop a new drug in under as a generic without having to worry about it. Or in some cases where the patent laws exist, and some of these generic drugs are just sold inappropriately, having not passed through anything significant. So how does the FDA ensure generic medications work? The FDA probably has the toughest standards of anybody, and they do a number of different things. There must be good quality control, which they get from the laboratory that makes them, and then they do some bioequivalence studies. And this is really what is out there. It is almost never done that efficacy studies, such as a phase 2 or phase 3 study or anything that is ever done with the generic manufacturer. It is assumed that the active agent is the same, the manufacturing standards are the same, the bioequivalence is the same, therefore use the drug. So in Canada, as an example, a generic manufacturer does not need to prove efficacy equivalence. So long as manufacturing standards are established, and that's defined by Health Canada, bioequivalence is defined as achieving blood levels in normal individuals between 80 and 125% of what a brand name product is. In 20 to 25 healthy young normal individuals, usually male. So that in itself may be a bit of a difference if you take a drug for instance, absorption, and be treated for absorption in an individual who may have a disease where that's a problem. Is it bioequivalence the same when you measure it in a normal individual? But these are the standards. Now, these are from the NCCN guidelines of the United States, and they talk about everything we've just talked about. Is the drug must be efficacious, safe, quality is assessed, and it must be an affordability of the regimen agent, i.e., usually a generic is cheaper than the brand name, but not always. So this was from a paper that was just published last year. And let's look at CML to begin with. One of the reasons generics become very important. The incidence of CML in the world is going up. The prevalence is definitely going up in CML because people are not dying for the most part from CML anymore. And this is a result, there are more people with CML, many of whom are going to stay on drug indefinitely. As we all know, for the most part, treatment-free remission remains a goal, the successful goal, maybe a quarter of the patients who actually start on the drugs. So why generics in general and in CML specifically? Well, more people needing the drug. As I said, for most people, treatment-free remission will not be an option. They'll either not achieve the standard to try it, or they will fail attempting it, which is roughly 50% of those. Therefore, they will remain on therapy at this point indefinitely, or at least in terms of when we come up with a different mode of action of something that will allow us to convert those people who do not achieve eligibility or fail on treatment and allow them to be successful. So therefore, the total cost of CML, if we were just to rely on brand name drugs, would continue to rise. And we need to bring down prices because it just is becoming more and more difficult to pay for these drugs. Now, in some countries, there are special funds that will fund brand name drugs for certain individuals, but this is not a unique process, even in that country or in other areas. So greater availability of a drug means more producers and less reliance on a single manufacturer. That becomes important. What I have seen, for instance, in cases where there are only one supplier of a drug, one's a generic, and something happens in the processing part, suddenly we have a shortage of drugs like cytarabine or cotrimoxazole or even penicillin. It becomes a real issue. And obviously the costs of producing it go down with the generic. Now, this is from a paper now from a number of years ago, but it looks at the price of drugs, the more generic manufacturers are in the market. And as you can see, as we go up, in this case, up to 19, the price drops to 10 to 20% of the cost of a brand name drug. So definitely competition definitely helps reduce costs, but not always. As we've seen cases where a generic drug is very cheap, but suddenly a new use for that drug comes along, the price of that drug, even a generic, will go up. And we saw this, for instance, with methotrexate that was used for chemotherapy. When it became useful in treating rheumatoid arthritis, the price of a generic tablet went up significantly. So this is from a paper in the Lancet Hematology just a couple of years ago, primarily from the MD Anderson group. And they looked at generics just in the United States. And if we take a look just at a map of generics up top, you can see that the price of some of the generics is almost equal to that of the brand name drug, which is Gleevec. And in some cases, actually, the price of generics initially were higher than the price of Gleevec, which is quite interesting. And as you can see, there's a 20-fold difference in the price of generics, and these are good generic manufacturers listed on this down the line. If you look at the price of brand name drugs, they're extremely expensive. So one of the reasons people like generics of first-line drugs versus going on the second line is look at the difference in price, which could be as many as 50-fold difference. So what are the potential disadvantages? Not all the generics are the same. They may vary from country to country or even within a country. And some of my colleagues in places like South America and India have experienced this as they go from having very active drugs with efficacy equivalent to brand to drugs which are almost not effective at all. Quality control is not standard in many places. Producers can vary from the top of the line to small hospitals and pharmacies. But another issue is when you establish the paperwork for the quality control in your particular processing facility, that doesn't say you can't do things like change the excipient a couple of years down the line, and you do not have to go through the standardization of that quality control. Monitoring of CML may vary from country to country, as we know, what depends on what's available. So it makes it very difficult to know that when your patient may be switched from a brand to a generic or between generics, are they maintaining the standards of efficacy and perhaps even the standards of toxicity, because we just can't get the appropriate testing to the patient or the patient to the testing. So this is from the Center for Drug Evaluation Research in the United States. And on the left-hand side, the column really looks at what a brand name needs to do to get approval. But you can see with the generic drugs, there's far less. And once you've gone beyond the quality control and some basic testing of the product, all you need is bioequivalence. There are no animal studies and no clinical studies necessary to bring that bioequivalent, that generic manufactured drug to the market. Now, what is bioequivalence? Well, this is looking at the area under the curve primarily for two different drugs and making sure they're roughly the same. As I mentioned earlier, I told you how this is done. It's primarily done with normal individuals. You take a dose of the brand name drug, measure the bioequivalence by area under the curve, wash it out for a period of time of several half-lives, and then do the same thing with the second drug. And you see that you really need to see something roughly 80 to 125%. A little tighter when you use area under the curve rather than Cmax. So what are pharmaceutically equivalent products? Well, these may actually be different. So the drug particle size, the excipients may change. There may be charcoal, or maybe cellulose, or maybe lactose. And some of the reasons you may find some side effects or even better tolerability with some of the drugs is the excipient. For instance, you may have a patient who's a bit lactose intolerant, and they've got a drug where the excipient is lactose. They may tolerate that drug as well as the other one, brand or a shift to a generic, because of that change. How you specifically manufacture it, the site of manufacture, the batch sizes of which they produce are all variable. But again, the documented bioequivalence is the main feature. So what do we look at what's out there in terms of review studies on generics? And a lot of what you will see in the literature are actually small centers where they particularly look at one generic in the case of CML and compared it usually to Gleevec. And they tend to be small, and very often there are issues with the equivalence and things of that nature, and people have found not necessarily that the generic drug is as good as the brand name. There is, however, very recently, towards the end of last year, a very good review in Blood Advances, which I'd like to refer to. And this is from a group actually in Turkey. And this is what they did. They looked at 104 articles and eliminated them if they weren't in English or not a full text. And they evaluated 91. And they found 36 full text articles which they used for their analysis. And I know these figures are small, but in terms of pharmacologic properties of bioequivalent, I advise you to go back to the paper. There were a number of really good studies that were out there from a number of different countries, South America, Asia, one in Europe. And they looked at a number of different things and compared things. They also looked at the outcomes of generics in terms of what happened to the patient. There were a number of different companies did this. And they looked at the molecular response for the most case afterwards. And they found that for the most part, they didn't see, in many cases, worsening of adverse events, although occasionally they did. But occasionally they did find that the responses did change. So go into details by looking at this paper. I really recommend it because it's probably the most thorough one that's out there. They looked at these generics in the frontline setting. The other previous table was after a switch from brand to generic. So again, they can't in this case report any changes, but there were one case where there's some adverse events reported, which were there in generics. Not there, they're not assessed obviously because we are not comparing it to brand name in frontline. So they did show some of these, and they did find that many of them were very effective and probably not more adverse events, at least significant adverse events, than they did with the original brand. So generics are generally safe and effective in CML therapy, although this is not always the case. And you have to go to a specific country because you will find someone will say very good with this brand, but not so good in this other one. But generally, if they're manufactured by a larger company with experience in generics, they tend to be good. And it's not country dependent. For instance, most of the generics we use in Canada are manufactured in India. They're definitely less expensive. So you need both short-term and long-term attention when a patient is switched or even started on the generic to make sure that there aren't new adverse events in terms of some toxicities that may reduce the patient taking the drug on a regular basis, or whether there's something long-term might pop up in terms of side effects, which would be due to the excipient rather than the brand name. So some recommendations. If you're forced to switch to a generic for a patient, or the only thing you can get front line is a generic, the patient it's important to monitor the patient. Monitor that patient very carefully for toxicity and monitor them for efficacy. Now, one of the problems I do find in Canada, which is an issue, is, as I told you, absorption may vary because the excipient changes. We find that wholesale pharmacies, particularly done outside the regular place, whichever generic they can get cheaper is what they will give the patient that day. I do find that once you've got a patient stable on a particular brand of generic, you know it's effective, you know there are no side effects, try, if at all possible, to keep the patient on the same generic and not flip them back and forth. And this, for the most part, is usually just a money issue with whoever the pharmacy or the wholesaler. It's usually not a production issue, or occasionally they might happen if a generic is made in only one plant and the plant has some issues. So make sure you know which generic your patient on. It's amazing how many patients think they're still on Gleevec when they're on a generic, and they don't know which generic they're on. So do that. I tend to say no substitution when writing a product. I don't mind that they get the generic. I just don't want them switching between brands of generic. And what you need to do to maximize benefit, reduce toxicity, know your patient again. Review the patient regularly. Use the best monitoring you can. And also check on certain things, like if your patient is changing other medications, you're likely not the only one prescribing for that patient. And they may be getting from other physicians medications which may reduce the absorption of certain genetics, increase the metabolism, decrease the metabolism of the drug. And so there may be drug interactions which may be significant with one product and not another. So how do you know your patient? Obviously, from the beginning, a good medical history and physical with an emphasis on drugs and comorbidities. A good systems review, particularly related to side effects of previous TKIs, rash, gastrointestinal, fluid balance issues. And also look at their lifestyle, which may impact on how the TKI is taken. Diet, travel history, occupation, things of this nature. Review your patient regularly. What drug are they taking and whether it is being changed? As I said, the pharmacies may not give them the same generic, even if they're all reliable. No other medications. Make sure you know the changes in your health, occupation, or whether even the patient can still pay for the drug. There are cases where even with the generic, affordability is an issue, and you find patients cutting the dose to half or taking drug holidays on a regular basis. These are important things. And confirm that there are no new adverse events when there's been a change in a medication. Monitor. Check blood counts, blood chemistry routinely, but especially when a drug is switched, and monitor for response. Hopefully you have access to good response. PCR testing is obviously the most easy to use, but if you have to use cytogenetics, you have to use FISH, that's all you have available, that's fine. And if you see a loss of response, be sure that you can try and get mutation testing to see if something has changed. What do you look for? Well, loss of efficacy. Generics of poor quality may be problems with absorption or even efficacy of the product itself. Side effects may affect compliance. New or different side effects. As I said, the excipient may be different. And companies with poor quality control may change the formulation. And they don't, even in a country like Canada, they do not have to report a formulation change. This is not uncommon, not just in manufacturers, but things like cosmetics and soaps and things like that. Patients take a product they've been using for years and suddenly they're getting rashes. And that's because something in the product formulation has changed. Now, again, getting back to that paper in 2019, here's an important issue. Because your patient is changed from a brand drug to a generic, you now change that patient to a different brand drug in order to avoid the generic. Well, here's a classic example from the States. Cost of a generic imatinib versus the second generation TKI. We won't go into which TKI. So I think in general, if your generic quality is good and your patient has been responding to that drug, switching them to a different brand with a different drug just to avoid the generic is not something which you necessarily should undertake. Now, if you find that in the switch to the generic, there's a loss of response, we'll work up the loss of response, and you may need to change to a different drug for that reason. So these are some administrative recommendations, and they probably vary from country to country. You should report adverse events and respond both to regulatory authorities, if you have it, but also to the manufacturer of the generic. Pharmacy should be required to report such issues. So if you tell your pharmacy you want to go from generic A to generic B because of side effect, the pharmacy should be reporting that. Patients need to be counseled to report deviations in prescriptions and keep their physicians informed of these things. Not just take everything for granted and assume they're always getting the same thing from the pharmacy. Now, a lot of what I'm giving here is based on discussions I've particularly with 3 colleagues, 2 in South America and 1 in India, who've had issues with generics in their countries for years. And we've discussed cases and what to do and things, and even presented together. And a lot of the discussions that have come up are based on things that we've brought in together. So I would like to thank Carla, Carolina, and Hemant for their discussions over the years on this. And they're excellent references on this issue in countries that have the experience. If you want to contact me down the line with any questions, here is my email, please do. And with that, I'll end the discussion.